The day after my grandfather was buried, 2 black SUVs rolled up my dirt driveway, tires crunching like a threat. Men in tactical vests stepped out, not police, not military, but hired guards sent by an HOA that claimed my inherited farm was never meant to be mine. They demanded to see the will, standing on land my family had worked for 3 generations, acting like they owned it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a paperwork dispute. It was a power grab. And they weren't planning to lose quietly. Before any letters showed up or trucks rolled in uninvited, my life on that land was quiet in a way most people forget still exists. The farm sat just beyond the edge of what used to be a small rural town, the kind of place that once had a feed store, a diner, and not much else. My grandfather bought the property long before the word development ever reached this valley. Back then, the land was nothing but open fields, a weathered farmhouse, and a long gravel drive that forced visitors to slow down and think before they arrived. I didn't grow up there full-time, but every important memory I had seemed to lead back to that farm. Summers were spent repairing fences, stacking hay, and learning how to fix things instead of throwing them away. My grandfather believed land was something you earned the right to keep by respecting it. He didn't trust banks, lawyers, or anyone who showed up with clipboards and rules. He trusted deeds, hard work, and time. When he passed, there was no dramatic reading of a will or drawn-out family fight. He had been methodical. Everything was filed, notarized, and settled long before his health failed. The farm was left to me outright. No shared ownership, no conditions, no hidden clauses. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a responsibility being handed down. I left my apartment, packed what mattered, and moved back permanently, planning to restore the farmhouse and slowly bring the land back to life. At first, nothing felt out of place. The mornings were quiet. The nights were darker than most people are comfortable with. I spent my days cleaning up old equipment, repairing the barn roof, and reacquainting myself with the rhythms of the land. It felt grounding, almost healing. I assumed the biggest challenges ahead would be physical labor and learning to manage the property on my own. What I didn't fully understand yet was how much the area around the farm had changed. Over the years, the town had expanded outward, and what used to be distant subdivisions had crept closer. New roads appeared. Decorative streetlights lined streets that hadn't existed when my grandfather was alive. And somewhere along the way, a homeowners association had formed, representing a development that now bordered one side of my land. Their houses were identical, carefully arranged, and governed by thick rulebooks meant to keep everything looking controlled and uniform. At first, I barely noticed them. A fence line separated us. The farm had always existed independently, untouched by neighborhood politics or committees. I assumed that hadn't changed. After all, the property wasn't part of their development. It never had been. Still, little signs started appearing that made me uneasy. Survey flags showed up near the boundary line one morning, gone again by evening. A white SUV drove slowly past my driveway more than once, always turning around just short of the farmhouse. Once, I found tire tracks in a field that hadn't been driven on in years. None of it was confrontational. None of it was direct. But it was persistent enough to feel intentional. Then came the mail. At first, it was harmless looking. Generic envelopes. No official seals. Just notices referring to community standards and property compliance. I didn't open them right away. They didn't make sense. I wasn't part of any community association, and the farm had its own deed, its own zoning, its own history. I assumed someone had made a clerical mistake. But the letters kept coming, each one a little more formal than the last. References to meetings I'd never attended. Rules I'd never agreed to. Claims that my property was subject to oversight I didn't recognize. Still, there were no outright demands yet, no threats, no fines. Just language that felt rehearsed, legal, and oddly confident. The strange part was how quickly the tone shifted from polite to presumptive. The association didn't ask if I was part of their jurisdiction. They wrote as if that question had already been settled. As if my grandfather's farm was merely an oversight waiting to be corrected. Neighbors from the development started watching more openly. People paused on their evening walks to look down the driveway. Phones came out. Conversations stopped when I approached the fence line. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was curiosity mixed with expectation, like they were waiting for something inevitable to happen. I began digging through old paperwork, pulling out deeds, plats, and county records my grandfather had carefully stored. Everything confirmed what I already believed. The land was separate. Always had been. But something told me that paperwork alone wasn't going to be enough. There was a growing sense that the farm didn't fit the image anymore. It wasn't landscaped. It wasn't uniform. It didn't answer to anyone. And in a place built on rules and appearances, that kind of independence can feel like an insult. I still didn't know how far they were willing to go. I didn't know they were already questioning the validity of the will itself. I didn't know that behind closed doors, decisions were being made that treated my inheritance like a mistake to be corrected rather than a right to be respected. All I knew was that the peace my grandfather had protected for decades was starting to crack. And whatever the HOA wanted from me, they weren't going to stop at letters forever. What started as letters quickly became pressure, and pressure became intrusion. The HOA stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and began acting as if my grandfather's farm had already been absorbed into their authority. Notices arrived weekly now, each one heavier with legal language and implied consequences. They cited violations that made no sense on agricultural land, unapproved structures, unregulated fencing, improper land use. The barn my grandfather built decades earlier was suddenly labeled non-compliant. The gravel driveway was described as an eyesore. Even the fields themselves were referenced as uncultivated green space in violation of community standards. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't been so relentless. I responded the only way that felt reasonable at first. I mailed copies of the deed. I included county zoning records. I highlighted the boundaries that clearly excluded the farm from the HOA's development. Each response was calm, factual, and documented. And each response was ignored. Instead of acknowledgement, I received escalation. Fines appeared next. Hundreds of dollars at a time, issued retroactively, claiming violations dating back months before my grandfather had even passed. There was no explanation of how those dates were calculated or why they believed they had jurisdiction in the first place. Just totals, deadlines, and warnings of further action if payment wasn't received. At the same time, the surveillance increased. HOA representatives began appearing near the fence line with clipboards and cameras, standing just far enough away to claim they were on public land. They took photos of the barn, the fields, my equipment. I would come home to find footprints where no one had been earlier that day. Once, I noticed stakes placed suspiciously close to the property line, as if someone were testing how much ground they could claim without confrontation. The neighbors watched everything. Some with curiosity, some with quiet approval. None intervened. It was clear the HOA board had framed this as a necessary cleanup, a final correction to an outdated piece of land disrupting their carefully managed image. The language of the notices shifted again. Now they referenced conditional ownership and pending verification of lawful inheritance. That was the first time the will itself was mentioned. Not directly, but as a question mark hanging over my right to be there at all. The implication was chilling. They weren't just trying to fine me into compliance. They were laying groundwork to challenge my claim entirely. I spent long nights at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, feeling the weight of something much larger than a dispute over fences or appearances. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. About erasing something that didn't fit and replacing it with something uniform and profitable. The next escalation came without warning. One morning, I woke to the sound of machinery. Not farm equipment. Construction vehicles. On the far edge of my land, just beyond the fence line, an HOA-contracted crew had begun clearing brush. They claimed it was part of a planned drainage project tied to the development. But their equipment crossed the boundary more than once, carving into soil that had been part of my grandfather's farm for generations. When I documented it and sent formal complaints to the county, the HOA responded not by stopping, but by accelerating. More notices. Larger fines. Claims that my failure to cooperate was obstructing community infrastructure improvements. They framed themselves as the reasonable party, burdened by my refusal to comply. What made it worse was how confidently they acted. Everything about their behavior suggested they believed the outcome was already decided. As if somewhere behind closed doors, permission had been granted. As if my resistance was a formality they intended to wear down over time. Then came the meeting notices. They invited me to attend HOA board meetings as a concerned stakeholder. The phrasing was deliberate. It didn't acknowledge me as an owner. It positioned me as someone whose interests were subject to their approval. I didn't attend. I knew enough to understand that stepping into their process would only legitimize their claim of authority. Instead, I hired a property attorney. The attorney's reaction was measured but serious. On paper, my claim was solid. The deed was clear. The zoning was agricultural. The farm was never annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction. But the attorney also explained something I hadn't considered deeply enough. HOAs don't always win by being right. Sometimes they win by exhausting people financially and emotionally until resistance collapses. The attorney warned me that the HOA appeared to be building a case not around rules enforcement, but around alleged defects in the transfer of ownership. They were questioning whether the will had been properly executed, whether there were undisclosed liens, whether historical boundary adjustments had ever been finalized. It was a scattershot approach, designed to create enough uncertainty to justify intervention. The timing made sense now. The delays. The silence in response to my documentation. They weren't confused. They were stalling while assembling something bigger. County offices became another battlefield. I filed formal complaints. I requested boundary verifications. I asked for enforcement against the HOA's encroachment. Each process moved slowly, bogged down by bureaucracy and backlogs. Meanwhile, the HOA moved fast, issuing demands and acting first, daring anyone to stop them. One afternoon, I returned home to find a notice physically posted on my barn door. Not mailed. Not emailed. Taped there like a warning. It declared the structure unsafe, unauthorized, and subject to immediate remediation. There was a deadline listed, barely 2 weeks out, and a statement reserving the HOA's right to take corrective action if I failed to comply. Corrective action. On a barn older than most of their houses. That was the moment fear crept in alongside anger. Not panic, but a sharp awareness that they were willing to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed easily. The idea of someone tearing down part of the farm under the cover of authority made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt before. I doubled down on documentation. Photos. Videos. Survey records. I started logging every visit, every notice, every instance of trespass. I stopped assuming good faith and started preparing for a fight. The HOA responded with another escalation. They claimed unpaid fines had reached a threshold that justified lien consideration. A lien. On land they didn't own, couldn't regulate, and had no legal right to touch. But the threat alone was enough to complicate everything. Refinancing. Insurance. Even basic repairs became riskier with that possibility hanging over the property. The stress was constant now. Sleep came in short bursts. Every sound at night made me wonder who was on the land and why. I found myself walking the fence line daily, not out of pride, but vigilance. Then the black SUVs appeared for the first time. They didn't approach the house. They parked at the end of the driveway, engines running, dark windows reflecting the sky. They stayed for 10 minutes, then left. No notice. No explanation. Just presence. It was intimidation disguised as oversight. The next letter explained it. The HOA claimed concerns about unauthorized occupancy and disputed ownership status, required them to verify the legitimacy of my possession of the property. They referenced private security contractors retained to protect community interests, pending resolution of the dispute. They demanded access to the will. Not a copy. The original. That demand crossed from absurd into alarming. No HOA has the authority to seize or verify estate documents. They knew that. Which meant the demand wasn't about legality. It was about pressure. About making me feel isolated, outnumbered, and unsure. I refused. The refusal triggered what felt like a countdown. More vehicles. More posted notices. Claims that my refusal to cooperate was being documented as evidence of bad faith. The implication was clear. They were preparing to move from harassment to force, shielded by a narrative they controlled. The neighbors stopped pretending not to watch. Phones came out openly now. People gathered at the edge of the development whenever the SUVs appeared, whispering, pointing, speculating. To them, it was entertainment. A drama unfolding on land they'd been told didn't quite belong to me. What none of them knew was that while the HOA was escalating in public, something was shifting quietly behind the scenes. County records requests were being processed. Survey confirmations were nearing completion. And the attorney had uncovered something in the HOA's own documents that suggested this entire campaign wasn't just aggressive, it might be illegal. But before any of that could come to light, the HOA made their boldest move yet. A move that would force everything into the open, whether they were ready for the consequences or not. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or flashing lights. It arrived with precision, confidence, and an unmistakable sense that the HOA believed the land was already theirs. The morning it happened, the black SUVs came back, 3 of them this time, rolling up the driveway in formation, stopping just short of the farmhouse like they were respecting an invisible boundary while preparing to cross it anyway. The men who stepped out wore tactical gear again, heavier this time, sidearms visible, posture rigid. They didn't fan out like police. They stood together, unified, as if their authority came not from law but from assumption. Behind them, at a careful distance, several HOA board members lingered near the fence line, clipboards in hand, faces tight with anticipation. They carried folders. Thick ones. Legal-looking. The kind meant to intimidate before a single word is read. This was the HOA's final move. They formally declared the inheritance under dispute, citing alleged defects in the will, historical boundary inconsistencies, and unresolved compliance violations. They claimed emergency authority to secure the property pending verification, which in plain terms meant they intended to control access to my own land. Their security contractors weren't there to observe. They were there to enforce. The weight of it settled heavily in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the gravity of realizing how far power can stretch when it goes unchecked. This wasn't about aesthetics or rules anymore. This was an attempted seizure dressed up as procedure. But they had miscalculated one thing. They assumed I was alone. What they didn't see, at first, were the county vehicles arriving at the far end of the driveway. Unmarked, understated, official. A surveyor's truck. A county recorder's car. And behind them, my attorney. The timing wasn't accidental. Weeks of quiet preparation had led to this exact moment. Every trespass logged. Every notice documented. Every encroachment mapped. The county survey had been expedited after evidence surfaced that the HOA knowingly crossed established boundaries. The attorney had uncovered internal HOA records showing they were aware the farm was excluded from their jurisdiction but pursued enforcement anyway, betting intimidation would succeed before scrutiny arrived. The armed guards hesitated when county officials stepped onto the land. Their confidence wavered, not gone, but disrupted. Authority recognizes authority, and this wasn't part of their plan. What followed was a procedural unraveling. The county survey confirmed, in stark detail, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the farm. None. The boundary lines were clear, recorded, and unchanged since before the development existed. The will had been properly executed, filed, and uncontested. There were no defects. No liens. No conditional clauses. The HOA's claims collapsed under the weight of verified public record. And then came the revelation that changed everything. The HOA's own documents showed they had attempted, quietly, to petition for annexation of my land years earlier. The request had been denied. They knew they had no authority. Their entire campaign, letters, fines, surveillance, armed security, had been built not on confusion, but on deliberate overreach. They weren't enforcing rules. They were manufacturing a crisis to force a transfer they were never granted. That realization hit the board members hardest. You could see it in their posture, the way their certainty drained when the narrative flipped. What they thought would be a demonstration of power was turning into a public exposure. Neighbors gathered now, drawn by the presence of county officials and the unmistakable tension in the air. Phones were everywhere. What had once been whispered speculation became open observation. The story was no longer controlled by HOA notices or meeting minutes. It was unfolding in real time, on land they had claimed didn't belong to me. The armed guards stood idle, suddenly aware they were standing on private property without lawful cause. Their presence, once intimidating, now felt excessive, even reckless. The HOA's attempt to appear authoritative had crossed into something far more dangerous and visible. County officials documented everything. The posted notices, the recorded threats, the attempted enforcement actions. What had been framed as a dispute was now being evaluated as potential harassment, trespass, and abuse of authority. The HOA's strategy of overwhelming pressure collapsed under scrutiny they never expected to face. And in that moment, standing on the same ground my grandfather had worked, protected, and trusted me with, the balance of power finally shifted. The HOA hadn't just lost a dispute. They had exposed themselves. As the SUVs began to leave, no longer in formation, no longer confident, it was clear this wasn't the end of the story. But it was the end of their illusion of control. What came next wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be handled behind closed doors. The days after the confrontation were strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that settles only after something volatile has burned itself out. The driveway stayed empty. No SUVs. No clipboards. No strangers pausing at the fence line pretending not to stare. The land felt like it could finally breathe again, as if it had been holding tension in its soil, waiting to see who would be allowed to claim it. That quiet wasn't accidental. It was the sound of systems grinding into motion, slow, bureaucratic, but unavoidable. The county moved first. Formal notices went out documenting the HOA's lack of jurisdiction and confirming, in writing, that the farm was entirely excluded from the development. Those confirmations weren't just sent to me, they were copied to every relevant office, from zoning to property records to enforcement. The ambiguity the HOA had relied on vanished overnight. There was no longer any room for interpretation, intimidation, or selective enforcement. Then came the legal consequences. The HOA was ordered to cease all contact related to enforcement, compliance, or oversight of the property. Every fine they had issued was declared void. Every notice was invalidated. Their claims about the will were dismissed outright, backed by the same county records they had hoped no one would check too closely. The attempted lien threats were flagged as improper, raising questions that extended well beyond my land. But the most significant impact didn't come from paperwork. It came from exposure. Once county findings became public record, neighbors began to piece together what had really happened. What had been framed as a stubborn landowner refusing to follow rules was revealed as an HOA board acting outside its authority, knowingly, and pushing until someone pushed back harder. The armed guards, once seen as a show of strength, were reinterpreted as an alarming escalation that never should have occurred. The board members who had stood confidently behind the fence line during the confrontation now found themselves under scrutiny from the very community they claimed to protect. Questions surfaced at meetings. Attendance increased. Residents wanted to know how dues had been spent, who authorized private security, and why annexation attempts had never been disclosed. Trust, once assumed, became something the board had to answer for. Internal fractures followed quickly. Some board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Others were voted out when emergency elections were called. New leadership promised transparency, reforms, and a recommitment to staying within legal boundaries. But promises have weight only when backed by accountability, and the shadow of what happened on my land didn't fade easily. Civil action followed. Not out of spite, but necessity. The trespass, harassment, and attempted enforcement had caused real damage. Soil disruption from unauthorized equipment. Legal expenses. Lost time. Emotional strain that no spreadsheet can fully capture. The case didn't drag on for years the way some do. The documentation was too thorough. The timeline too clear. The HOA's own records told a story they couldn't rewrite. The settlement reflected that reality. Funds were allocated to restore damaged portions of the land. Legal costs were covered. Formal apologies were issued, Not the vague kind meant to deflect responsibility, but specific acknowledgments of wrongdoing entered into record. Most importantly, binding agreements were put in place preventing future boards from attempting similar overreach without explicit county approval. The farm's independence was no longer just historical. It was fortified. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. I went back to repairing fences, tending fields, and restoring parts of the farmhouse that had been neglected during months of stress and distraction. The work felt different now. More intentional. More grounded. Every post set and board replaced felt like reclaiming not just land, but time that had been stolen by unnecessary conflict. Neighbors changed, too. Some avoided eye contact, embarrassed by how readily they'd accepted the HOA's version of events. Others approached cautiously, offering quiet support or belated understanding. A few admitted they had always wondered how a farm could suddenly be subject to rules that made no sense. Watching the situation unfold had forced them to confront how easily authority can be misused when no one questions it. The fence line remained, but it no longer felt like a boundary under threat. It felt like a line that had been tested and held. What stayed with me most wasn't the legal victory or the public vindication. It was the realization of how fragile ownership can feel when challenged by organized power. The farm had survived decades of change because my grandfather understood something many people forget. Land doesn't just need care. It needs defense. Not always with confrontation, but with knowledge, records, and the willingness to stand firm when someone decides your existence is inconvenient. The HOA had assumed rural land was passive, that it would yield under pressure the way people often do. They underestimated the weight of history, documentation, and someone who refused to be rushed off ground that wasn't for sale. Over time, the development expanded in other directions. New houses went up. New boards formed. But the farm remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged in its boundaries and purpose. The fields grew. The barn stood. The driveway stayed gravel, unapologetically imperfect in a world obsessed with uniformity. The experience left scars, but it also left clarity. Rules matter. Governance matters. But so do limits. When organizations forget those limits, when they prioritize control over community, they stop serving and start taking. And the moment that happens, someone eventually pushes back. Not because they want to fight, but because they have no other choice. Standing on that land now, it's easy to imagine my grandfather watching all of it unfold, shaking his head at the audacity of strangers trying to claim what they never earned. He used to say that ownership isn't proven by what you say you own, but by what you're willing to protect responsibly. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. And the farm remains, not because it complied, but because it endured. So the next time an authority claims you don't belong somewhere you've always stood, the question isn't whether they sound confident. The question is whether you're willing to ask who gave them the right, and what happens when the answer is nothing at all.